Hi everybody, Matt back with you. Today I'm up on Wadsworth Moors, Midgley Moors, mixing between the two. I'm going to show you some of the ancient rocks and things that you can find up here and some of the folklore and stories behind it. Before that though, look at this view. This was the view that I grew up with. It's like being on top of the world. So although it is a fairly nice day today and it's very warm, it's always windy up here, so it may well be that a lot of this is done in voiceover or just with some music. I'll try and get across the little bits of folklore that I know about these sites. There's probably a lot more stories than what I'm going to tell you, so if it does interest you, search them up. I'll give you the bits that I know. Okay, so this is the first rock on Midgley Moor. It actually stands as a boundary stone, and it's known as Chur Joan. Now the reason it's most recently known as that is because there's a story of a milkmaid who went from Ludden to Peckett Well in a snowstorm and was sadly found dead at this spot. So this stone was erected in her memory. However, there are other tales about it. That's probably the most famous one, and it is probably the most famous stone on the moors. But let me tell you a few more. Seems to be a whole host of stories to go along with Churn Milk Joan. One of which, of course, is the straightforward one of leave a bit of money on top of it and take what's there if you need it to help a weary traveller. It's kind of a good luck ritual on your way. Also, at midnight on New Year's Eve every year, when the church bells of St Michael's start ringing, the Milk Joan is actually supposed to spin round 3 times. Now, I guess if it actually did that, we would have seen that by now. But again, this is all just the folklore of it. Another story suggests that it's named in folklore after an old hag or a spirit called Churn Milk Peg. And Peg apparently lived in nut bushes. And if any children used to come along and put their hands in to try and steal unripe nuts, she would try and force them to smoke a pipe that she had. Obviously, I'm not right sure if this area has ever been covered in nut bushes. Apparently as well, if the children didn't behave and carried on, she would say to them that she would take them to Toad Lad. And I can only imagine that means the devil himself. So yes, there's quite a lot of interesting little stories about this. Also that maybe this rock here could be the original boundary stone. And this one is obviously put up in memory of Joan, but this could be the original one, which we'll also find is an interesting twist on other stories of some of the rocks that we come across later, according to where boundaries are. The sun's coming out, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so we're now heading from Wadsworth Moor onto Midgley Moor. I'm not sure if this path is almost the boundary. Ahead of us in the distance, depending on the size of the screen you're looking at, you might see the windmills at Stalls at Halifax. Down in the bottom of the valley, which you can't see at the moment, is Ludden. Now all the way along here are these shooting ranges, which I suppose are used on August the 12th still for grouse shooting. I must be honest, when I was a kid we used to come up and look in these and quite often you'd find like gun cartridges inside. That doesn't sound like a very exciting thing to do today, but back in the 80s we had to find things to do.
Right, our next stone is just ahead. I suppose it looks a little bit like a mini version of Chur Milk, Joan. But this one is called the Greenwood Stone. Now this is a boundary stone that was in 1775, as you can see the date on it. Now it's not actually the original Greenwood Stone. There was a reference to a Greenwood Stone being here, actually back in 1594. And as I say, this was a boundary stone, but I don't think the boundary is in the same place anymore. That original stone, it's believed to be somewhere lying flat on the ground nearby. I don't know exactly where it is, but anyway, there is actually not just this stone. There is another another stone called Greenwood Stone B. And again, I've never found that yet, but I'll have a little look around and see if I can find it. It's supposed to be a few yards from this location. So I'm wondering if this is it. Obviously this looks like it could have been a stone that was once standing. I can't find anything else, so I'm going to call it Greenwood Stone B. If I'm wrong, I know a few people who are likely to point me in the right direction and tell me that it's wrong. Okay, so the next stone is just ahead. This one is called Robin Hood's Penny Stone. Now, obviously, it's not really the size of a penny, but there's a lot of tales of Robin Hood from this area, notably in Crag Vale, Brighouse, and of course up here on Midgley Moor. However, the real story behind this rock is a little bit different. The Robin Hood connection is purely because he's thought to have come through this area, and that's connected to a rock we'll see in a minute. However, this is a plague stone, and what would happen, you'll see in a minute, there's a hollowed out section at the top, and victims of the plague would come up here and they would put money in, like there's some there now, and this would actually be full of vinegar. And so what they'd do, they'd leave the money in the vinegar, and somebody, I presume, would come and take the money. That would pay for the goods, and that victim can then come back the next day, hopefully, if they're still living, and get some food that would be here for the payment that they've left. That's what we think anyway. But however, the Robin Hood connection doesn't finish up here with this rock. Like I say, there is a connection to the next rock that we're going to. Final rocks on this hillside right here. This is known as the Miller's Grave. Okay, so I'm now inside the Miller's Grave. It's got very, very windy, so I don't know if you can hear me. If so, my mouth and words will be different because I'll do a voiceover. But the folklore here, the Robin Hood connection, is that this is the grave of Much the Miller's son. But there is a different folklore story, one that's a bit more well known. And our story there revolves around a boy called Lee, who lived in Hebden and worked at Mayroyd Mill near the train station. And sadly, he was a miller and he committed suicide. Now, back then, that was not the done thing to do because everybody was obviously far more God-fearing back then. What happened is his suicide set in motion a very weird chain of events for the people of Midgley. So because of the nature of his death, Lee was just buried, I think, pretty much next to the side of the road at a crossroads in Midgley. As he was lying there in unconsecrated ground, it seemed to set off superstition and dread in the people who lived in Midgley at the time.
people became too fearful to pass the location next to the side of the road. They'd avoid that spot altogether. And this fear and dread got so great that eventually a group of people came and dug up the body. People did try and stop them, but the people who stopped them ended up being stoned. Not that way, even though we're near Hebden. And the body of Lee was battered by those who dug it out, and he was dragged up here and buried in this grave. Now even that didn't seem to stop this fearfulness and superstition, because he's still in unconsecrated ground, and this kind of ghost of Lee seemed to haunt the village of Midgley time after time. However, eventually Lee's body was taken from here, and it was buried in the churchyard at Heptonstall, which finally officially laid his ghost to rest. So although this is quite an impressive sight now, even now I should say, it must have looked quite spectacular back in the day when it was a full-size cairn, but over time stones have been removed, treasure hunters have been looking for treasure on this site. Now it's used for other things. I think maybe the winter solstice is to do with the sun rising and the position of these rocks. That's not my strong point, I'm afraid, so I can't really go into much depth about that, but I know it's still visited quite often. Yeah, so that kind of concludes our look at some of the rocks up here and a bit of the folklore to do with it. I saw a reservoir in the distance, and I kind of feel like going and looking there next. Okay, so we finish our wandering around Midgley Moor in this quarry here, which I think is called something like Scotch Quarry. Yes, I have changed clothes. I've just done the reservoir one before coming back to finish filming that. Sorry if I confuse you. However, two reasons for me to be in this particular spot. One is a personal one. The 1921 census came out recently. 100 years ago, this quarry was actually managed by maybe my great uncle or great uncle Dent, who was also the person who designed the Smeaton Hill War Memorial in Peckett. He owned two quarries, this one and one just above Peckett. This one's actually pretty big, so I'm very tempted to come and stick a flag in it and reclaim it as my own. However, back to Midgley Moor, and you've got to remember a lot of those stories we've talked about to do with the rocks go back a very long way, but there are occasionally discoveries that suggest there were certainly people living up there on the moors, maybe back in the Bronze Age or even further back. Outlines of small huts that maybe were built out of the stone up there and lived in. There was a quarry, I'm not sure if it was this particular one or one slightly further over, about 100 years ago, where they actually discovered some bodies of, I presume, like prehistoric man, possibly not as old as that, but yeah, they were all buried in a line, etc. So they had to be removed carefully. I'm not sure quite what happened to them. I can't find much info other than I know that there were some bodies found in a quarry 100 years ago. So if you have a bit more info on that, do let me know, but I'll try and do a bit more research. So yeah, so there we go. This is my quarry, and it's quite an impressive one. So we'll have a little look around, but until next time, enjoy this beautiful weather. We'll see you soon.